Hello, I am ZHAO Chuang. Let's talk about Yiran the Lufengosaurus. Lufengosaurus is a well-known basal sauropodomorph dinosaur. Its body presents a blend of physical features of sauropods and theropods. Such a vague appearance suggests it is a primitive species. Lufengosaurus is the first dinosaur independently excavated by the Chinese. Its study was conducted quite early, and the many fossil materials gave us an in-depth understanding of it. Lufengosaurus lived in the early Jurassic. The Lufeng Formation in Yunnan, where the Lufengosaurus was discovered, is the earliest stratum of dinosaur fossils found in China. So, Lufengosaurus is also one of the earliest discovered dinosaurs. As the name Lufengosaurus suggests, this dinosaur was discovered in Lufeng, Yunnan. This name paid homage to its fossil location. Let's take a look at its basic structures. First, it was an early sauropodomorph. In the past, this type of dinosaur was often classified into a large family called prosauropods, indicating its primitive stature. It had the elongated neck of sauropods and a relatively massive body, but its forelimbs were relatively short in contrast with its long hindlimbs. Scholars classified it into prosauropods in the early years, but this classification has no longer been used recently. We now generally consider it a basal species of the clade Sauropodomorpha, because many previously found so-called prosauropods, such as Panfigia, Plateosaurus, Lufengosaurus, and Massospondylus, were later proved to not belong to the same family, and some even distantly related. Let's look at its entire body structure. Its body was relatively slender, and its neck had shown a sign of lengthening. Its neck was somewhat flexible, unlike later sauropods, whose necks were interlocked tightly by cervical ribs. Its cervical ribs were short. Its tail was long and robust. Its head was as small as most sauropodomorphs but more square and similar to that of theropods. Its teeth were delicate and sharp, with no obvious worn-out traces, indicating that this dinosaur mainly used its teeth for feeding and might have a poor chewing capability, which is a primitive state. Of course, some people think that the shape of its teeth might suggest a partially omnivorous diet, not only feeding on plants, because at least some reptile remains have once been found in the stomach content fossil of a massospondyled dinosaur. Lufengosaurus also belongs to this family, so some scholars believe it may be capable of preying on small animals. Of course, different people hold different opinions. Those small animals were possibly eaten mistakenly, which is also common for herbivores. Also, occasionally preying on some small animals is relatively common among extant herbivores. You should have seen that some deer often prey on birds, and sheep occasionally prey on birds. Its teeth were small, sharp, and relatively numerous. If you look at this model carefully, you can see that its teeth extend all the way to the bottom of its eyes, unlike those of many later sauropods, which were often located closer to the front of the mouth. The mouth muscles of this dinosaur are relatively far back, that is, the pink part on this model, because there is no such cheek fossa structure in the front of its face. It was unlike many later sauropods or some hadrosaurids, this part of which was depressed inward and considered to have cheeks in the past, but is now considered to have forward connecting muscles. But Lufengosaurus did not have such a structure. Its facial structure was relatively primitive, quite similar to a theropod or crocodile. Its eyes were relatively large, and the entire eyeball was also very large, but the exposed part was pretty small. Its eyes were still located relatively lower and forward, but those later sauropods' eyes were particularly far backward and upward. This makes its entire head look a bit like a lizard or snake because its lateral temporal fenestra was relatively large, unlike many later sauropods, whose lateral temporal fenestra had moved below the eyes. Its neck might look like an eel, as it had very complex muscles, which appeared relatively flexible, muscular, and covered with a lot of skin. The underside of its throat might covered with a softer skin. As a herbivorous animal, instead of a throat pouch at this position, it might have a relatively large structure that could accommodate food and facilitate swallowing because its mouth was already quite large. The muscles on the sides of its neck were developed, so we can see that this reconstructed model displays a stout neck. Its shoulder blades were thick, with many muscles attached, making its shoulders appear plump. Its coracoid bones were also huge. Viewed from the front, its shoulders are pretty broad, and its chest is attached with many muscles, which facilitates the flexible motion of its forelimbs. Its forelimbs were quite short. The forelimbs of Lufengosaurus in adulthood were very short in contrast with its hindlimbs. However, the front and rear limbs seemed no big difference in childhood. The juvenile Lufengosaurus possibly used all four limbs to walk, as the forelimbs of their juveniles looked relatively long. Then, at a certain stage of adulthood, its hind limbs might have become more and more developed, and it would use its forelimbs to walk less and less. In the end, it would look like this in its adulthood, and entirely walk on its hind legs. The hands on the forelimbs of Lufengosaurus were somewhat flexible. Its front feet were relatively flexible, each with 5 digits, that could make wide-range movements. Some complete forelimb fossils show that Lufengosaurus wrists could raise upward. Some early studies believe that the adult Lufengosaurus could also walk on all fours because what the fossil showed was consistent with forward-walking movements. Of course, as mentioned, we now believe that in the adult state, it rarely used its forelimbs to walk. It may occasionally use its forelimbs to assist in walking, but it is still a bipedal animal. The flexible claws on its forelimbs could play roles in digging plants, fighting between the same kind, or defending itself when encountering predators. It had huge claws on its forelimbs, especially the thumb claw, shaped like a giant hook. It had 5 fingers on each forelimb. The nails on the last 2 were vestigial, and the 2 fingers were very short. Only the first 3 had huge claws. Its hind limbs were pretty developed, with 4 visible toes. They were actually 5 toes, but the 5th toe had degenerated very small, which might be wrapped in skin and flesh when alive. You can see it on this lateral side, a little protrusion here. This is the trace of the degenerated 5th toe and metatarsal bone. In addition, when walking, its hindlimbs would have 4 toes fully touching the ground. Its big toe was not as small as that of theropods. On the contrary, this big toe was huge. And the claw of the big toe was also the largest among the following toes. The toes were longer than the other from front to back, but the last one was slightly shorter. The entire foot was similar to that of a theropod, and the 3rd toe was the longest. Currently, we have not found the skin of this type of dinosaur. We can roughly speculate that it might have relatively large scales to protect its feet like theropods when it was alive. Based on the general sauropods, we designed the skin of its entire body, and gave it a structure with small scales interspersed with some large ones. Lufengosaurus had a very thick long tail. From the top, you can see that the tail is robust. From its skeleton, we can see strong muscles attached on both sides of the tail. These muscles can be divided into 2 groups. The lower muscles start from the ilium and extend all the way to the tail end. The upper muscles run forward from the tail to the back and connect to the neck, forming a suspension bridge structure, allowing the tail to stretch backward flatly without effort. The muscles on the back would pull the tail off the ground for long periods. We don't know the color of Lufengosaurus, so we temporarily designed it a colorful look. The habitat environment of Lufengosaurus was relatively complex. In traditional taxonomy, Lufengosaurus has 2 species. One is Lufengosaurus huene, which is the type species, and the later named is Lufengosaurus magnus. This classification is currently under debate. Lufengosaurus huene's body length was generally about 5 meters, while the Lufengosaurus magnus could reach more than 9 meters, which resulted in some scholars objecting to assigning them to 2 species. Some new research shows that Lufengosaurus magnus may be a fully adult Lufengosaurus huene, which means that Lufengosaurus huene may be in its juvenile state, and Lufengosaurus magnus in its adult state. These two may be the same animal. Even if they were the same animal, the 9-meter-long adult was still not as massive as the later sauropods. Its body was still very flexible and could move about the forests and walk on the plains. The habitat would range widely, so we can give it a more colorful look. The above is about some creating stories of Yiran the Lufengosaurus. Thank you all.